Here's some brief but important background info. For about 12 years, my family owned a house on a hill in a spread-out neighborhood in northern Nevada. The house was actually the highest house in the small valley and was somewhat remote. The layout of the house is important, so please bear with me. The building itself was bizarre, as it was built into the slope of the hill. It was technically 3 stories, as the bottom level was half underground. We called it the basement, but I guess it wasn't. That's where my bedroom and the laundry room was. You entered the house from the second level, kitchen, dining, and living room, and on the third level was 2 small bedrooms. The first occurrence was when I lived there alone. My parents had purchased the home but couldn't make the move for a couple of months. I was watching over the place and helping them with getting the bottom level livable. It was concrete and exposed drywall at this point, but I still chose to live down there. One night I was camped out and watching TV when I felt a strange sensation, as if there was a lot of static electricity in the air. I remember literally watching my arm hair stand up. I saw something in my peripheral and looked up to see the bedroom door sliding closed. Not violently, but slowly. Again, this was an old sliding wooden door, one that slides into the jamb/wall. No explanation like a possible draft made any sense. It was jarring, but I wasn't all that scared. I was so new to my surroundings that I was just frustrated that I couldn't figure out the cause. Through all my experiences in that house, I was rarely outright terrified. As the family got settled into the new home, there was a period of frequent activity, weird noises, and misbehaving electronics. My family was myself, mother, and stepfather. My older sisters would live there on and off, and one of them was there for the next major event. Late one night, I heard a sudden and somewhat violent commotion upstairs. Directly above me was the kitchen, and anything happening in there was always obnoxiously loud, even just someone walking in the kitchen. The tile in the kitchen and general acoustics allowed for some really annoying sound travel. The sound carried so well that whenever I heard footsteps, I could tell which family member it was up there and what they were doing. If one of our dogs was in there, I could literally tell which dog it was by the little tippy taps. I often caught them in the act of stealing food or generally misbehaving this way. It was incredibly irritating. This particular noise sounded like 2 large men wrestling. It was loud. I heard a chair drag and 2 distinct massive individuals literally fighting, rolling around, etc. It went on for several minutes. My parents were out of town, but one sister was also home, her bedroom being directly above the kitchen. My first thought was that my sister must have had some friends over and that they had a few drinks and her guy friends were horsing around. I was livid and called her up to chew her out, only for her to answer and ask what on earth I was doing that was so loud. We both worked up the courage to meet in the kitchen while staying on the phone. The lights were on and no one was in there. Everything was neat and in order. The noise only stopped when we neared the kitchen. This had gone on for so long that we had plenty of time to contemplate what it could be while it was still happening. She ultimately stayed in my room that night. The next incident was really 2 incidents. My mom found a dead little bunny on the porch. The only unusual thing about it was that it was placed evenly on the doormat and had no obvious injuries. We have dogs, but they didn't have access to this area. My stepdad is a sweetheart and actually buried it. Here's where it gets weird. About a week later, I was chatting with my mom as she took a break from her schoolwork. She had been using her first or second gen iPhone to utilize the dictionary thesaurus website. This was before iPhones had voice command capabilities like nowadays, so the model is important. As we chatted, her phone went to sleep from inactivity. At some point, the phone lit up and the page she was on refreshed itself, as if someone had put a new search in the query. We both saw this happen and no one was touching the phone. We were obviously distracted and watched the phone to see what it was doing. The page loaded, and in the thesaurus search bar was rabbit killer, with obviously 0 search results. My stepdad, an IT guy, tried to convince my mom of a technical reason for this, but later told me that it wasn't actually possible, and he didn't know how it could have happened. iPhones were a little more primitive back then, so no Siri. For months, we endured random noises and doors closing, so often that we actually kind of got used to it. It rarely felt hostile, and when it did feel hostile, it strangely didn't feel directed at us. It was like some spiritual shit was going on, and we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time and happened to witness it. At a certain point, it did seem to take notice of us, and when it did, it really did. This is the last major incident that I will list here. One night, my parents claimed they woke up to the dogs growling on the bed. They both sat up and flipped a lamp on to find me standing over their bed. My parents both wear glasses, but they aren't blind, and it's hard to mistake me. I'm about 6'3" and tower over the family. They tried to talk to me, but got nothing in return. They were convinced that I must be sleepwalking, despite having no history of sleepwalking. They said it was actually funny, and they were amused by trying to wake me up. This thing eventually wandered off after studying them for a few minutes. What they didn't know was that I was not home that night. I was crashing at a friend's house. The next day, they were cracking up telling me about my bizarre behavior in the middle of the night. I honestly debated not even telling them that I wasn't actually home the previous night because I didn't want my mom to flip. She took it well, but I can't tell if she believed me. Some notable details. The house is near a reservation, although I'm wary of assuming anything about a culture that I'm not a part of. We are all white except my stepdad, who is Native American. This is also an area where people claim to see a lot of UFO activity. In fact, this part of Nevada in general is hot. It's considered to be a hotbed for paranormal energy in general. When I was about 17, I was living with my dad and his girlfriend for a short period of time. I was in my room playing my game and noticed they started getting rowdy in the next room over. It was around midnight, and I could tell they were drunk. They did this constantly, and it doesn't really faze me anymore. It just starts getting kind of annoying. I knew it was going to last for hours, so I grabbed my hoodie and snuck out my first floor bedroom window, because the last time they did this, the cops had to be called, and I just didn't want to deal with that. We lived on a reservation in Midwest America, so it gets damn creepy at night. The best way I can lay it out is it's on a huge stretch of road, and I live in the area which everyone called the new housing, which was on one end of the reservation, and I had to walk to Garrett Hill, which was on the other end of said reservation, just to see my grandpa, which meant I had to walk a mile of road that luckily had street lamps. So I started walking. Grandpa and I were fairly close, and he would let me crash there from time to time, and I was betting he was awake right then, so I didn't have to worry about waking him up. Coming up on the right was my high school. Nothing to report. Just empty with bright lights with the school sign saying, "Have a good summer, Warriors." Then immediately on my left is the school dormitories and the church, which stood a good 5 stories. It was dark, clearly empty, and it just gave off this very eerie vibe, due to the fact that it used to be a Catholic reform school for Native youth. I knew this because my grandpa used to go there. He'd tell me stories of what they used to do to them, some harmful and some very harmful. I was already creeping myself out with these stories, and I just kept walking. I tried to calm down, tried to put those thoughts out of my head, and it seemed to work for a second, but noticed up ahead that the road seemed to look a little longer, with more space in between of what looked to be 3 or 4 more street lamps that are left on the road. The houses on the left were completely empty and had been for a while by the looks of it. On the right was a pasture of unkept grass, about as tall as my neck. But due to the road being on an inclined surface, the grass was about as tall as my knees, and I could see as much as the street lamp I was under would illuminate, which was still a large sum of grass. Reluctantly, I kept going. At this point, I felt uncomfortable, but that sounds crazy. Why would I feel uncomfortable in a place I know like the back of my hand? It just didn't make sense. But in that moment, it just felt unfamiliar, almost otherworldly. Next thing I know, I hear the sound of rustling. I stop and stare out at the grass. I was under one of the street lamps, which allowed me to see pretty far, but it felt like I was seeing nothing, like my mind was playing tricks on me. I felt kind of stupid and tried to continue forward. Just then, the rustling came back, and when I looked back, it stopped. Now, I know I wasn't crazy because that was as clear as day. I widened my search pattern, looking up and down, right and left. Then I looked far back where the light could barely reach. I hovered slowly from left to right. The moment I saw it, my heart stopped completely. It was a dark figure, about a foot taller than the grass. The more my eyes adjusted, the more it stuck out to me. My knees felt weak, and all I could hear was my breathing. I couldn't use my voice. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. Then I saw it retreat into the grass. I guess it thought I didn't know where it was, so it just crouched back down or something. I tried to play along and just kept moving forward. But just when I thought I was safe, the rustling came back and was getting louder, and it was getting closer. That's when I started to run. I reached the entrance to the dirt road to lead up to my grandpa's house and kept running, but stopped when the rustling stopped. I don't know why, but I looked back at the rustling grass and immediately wished I hadn't. Under the last street lamp in the road stood a tall figure, about 10 feet tall, wearing a trench coat and a top hat. I freaked out at the sight of this and booked it down this unkempt grassy knoll that was a shortcut to Grandpa's. My lungs burned like gasoline, but I knew I couldn't stop. Then I heard the same rustling through the grass that didn't sound like footsteps. It sounded like it was hovering, but still pushing over the grass. It was constant and it was getting louder. Then I hear an ear-piercing growl that sounded like the devil himself. It said the words, "Come here." In one stride, I made it onto the gravel leading up to the front door to Grandpa's, immediately letting myself in. I slammed the door, locked it, and started breathing out exhaust. Grandpa comes to see what's going on, armed with a rifle, but sees me on the ground, sweating bullets with tears in my eyes. It took me a moment to calm down and tell him everything. I told him why I was there, the creepy nature of the school and the tall figure. He seemed rather silent on that subject. I asked him about it to see if he knew anything, but he didn't answer my question. He told me to rest up and said I could sleep on the couch. That was the end of that conversation. So I did just that, grabbed a blanket, laid down on the couch, turned on the TV, and just dozed off. I woke up the next morning and saw my uncle sitting on the recliner, as it looked like he just got off work. I said hey and basically told him everything that I told Grandpa the night before. He just said, "I think you met the tall man." I didn't know who he was talking about, but I pressed on. He explained that the tall man was a spirit that prey on lonely souls at night, and sightings are always the same, 10 feet tall, wearing a trench coat with a top hat. One woman claims she saw him behind the building where they park the buses, said he was tall as the buses. I asked if he ever met him. He chuckled before he says in his res accent, "I was getting cigarettes one night. It was late. No one was outside but me. I had to cut the trip short because, on the way there, I saw him under a street lamp. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I got so scared I booked it back to the house." I asked him, "Then what?" "I quit smoking," he chuckled to himself. Then I brought up Grandpa and the fact that he didn't want to talk about it. "It took his sister," my uncle said, leaning in like he was telling me a big secret. My eyes widened with curiosity and pressed for more details. He leaned in some more and said, "A long time ago when Grandpa was much younger than you, his sister was older, and she was rebellious, didn't take any shit from the priests and nuns. She was punished day in and day out, but she never gave up her spirit. Until one night, she told your grandpa she was running away, and he was coming with her. Remember, these places didn't have roads yet, so it was all open field. They hastened their escape and had to run from the priests, but Grandpa was lagging behind, just a little guy. So she had him hide in the tall grass, and they thought they had escaped, but a tall figure comes from behind them. Your grandpa got scared and ran out of the grass, and the priests found him. They tried to find his sister in the grass, but they couldn't find her. He thought she had escaped, but then, only moments later, in the distance, they heard a bloody murder scream, and he knew she was gone." I had to process all of that for a second until he said this last thing. That's why he made an oath never to talk about him or say that name again. I guess there were some stories Grandpa didn't like to share. I guess for good reason. Later, I saw him through a window on the porch, drinking coffee in his own headspace. I guess our conversation brought back some old memories. I just hope it doesn't happen again.
Growing up, we stayed at my grandparents' house during the holidays. Both my parents worked full-time, so it made handling us over the vacation difficult. Our grandparents lived in the countryside in an old creepy house. I always remember it had a weird smell to it. Kinda sweet, but not in a good way. I want to say old cheese, but to be honest, I don't know what that smells like. My brother and I would share a room. We had a separate, musty old bed each with what I called old people flowers print on the blankets. Whenever our parents said we were staying there, we begged not to. Not only was it boring, but as we got older, we noticed weird things more and more. Maybe we slept heavier when we were younger, I don't know. At night, we would hear our grandparents' voices outside calling to us. The first time it happened, I looked out the window, but saw nothing. When I turned around, I saw my brother was awake. "I hear them too," he whispered, eyes wide. I hurried back to bed and put my blankets over my head. After that, we started hearing knocks from inside the walls at night. Never more than one at a time, though. So, thinking back, this wasn't paranormal? Here's one event I remember quite clearly. My brother and I were a little older by now, and my grandparents let us stay up a little later to watch TV or read or whatever. They always went to bed around 8 p.m. and told us that we had to be in bed by 9 to 9:30. Being a little rebellious, we always stayed up until around 10 or even later after we figured out that they slept like logs. Anyways, we were staying up watching TV in the living room. I was lying down on the old brown sofa, and my brother was sitting on the floor, leaning against it. We then hear a knock behind us. We both kind of jump because of the silence of the house and the suddenness of the knock. But when nothing further happens, we settle back down into watching TV. Then, we hear another knock off to the left of us, on the wall we were closest to. Then I hear my grandfather's voice calling out to me from outside. Then another knock, this time from the TV stand. We ran so fast to our bedroom we didn't even turn off the TV. We dove under our covers and pulled the blankets over our heads. Unfortunately, the knocks and voices followed us, but somehow we fell asleep. We awoke to our grandfather yelling at us for leaving the TV on all night and wasting his money. We tried explaining what happened over breakfast, but our grandfather refused to believe us. Our grandmother just stayed silent. We begged our parents over the phone to let us come home early. They eventually relented. Our dad took time off work or something. After that, he always made alternate arrangements for our holidays. Talking to him later in life, he told us that he experienced the same kind of things as a kid and could tell by our terror that we were telling the truth. We still went over to our grandparents for special events like Christmas, but thankfully, never stayed overnight there, ever again.
So I've always brushed off paranormal activity as coincidence, or I've tried to find rational reasoning, even though I've always been intrigued by it. But lately I have no way of explaining it to myself. So for some background, I've recently moved houses. I used to live in a big old manor house. I'm not sure what year it dates back to, but it's next to its twin, the main house, which dates back to 1781. So I'm assuming it's around the same time frame. Obviously, with a building this old, it's very daunting, and you'd assume it's haunted. It also got turned into an old people's home at some point in time, but I've recently moved to another house that dates back to the 1800s. Whilst I was in the manor house, me and everyone else living there would experience weird things. Nothing dangerous, but weird nonetheless, and we'd all brush it off as it's an old house and I was a kid. things that would happen frequently: doors closing/opening, electronics and light bulbs turning off and on, doors locking, and loud noises coming from inside the bedrooms. Like banging noises. I don't want to drag this on longer than it needs to be. I have a lot of experiences in that house, so if anyone wants more in-depth explanation, feel free to ask questions, but to the point. I've always had extremely vivid dreams that feel and look real, to the point where when I wake up, I still believe I'm dreaming. Since moving to this house, the same things are happening, lights turning on and off, etc. We had a weird experience with our Alexas playing music randomly, old-timey music. But the thing that makes me feel crazy is the dreams. Just before I fall asleep, I keep hearing a man speaking in my room. It's like he's next to me, it's that clear. But I'm always on the verge of sleep, so I just brush it off as a dream. But what really got me was I got a phone call the other day from my mom whilst I was out, asking me where I was. I had been out all day, and it was 2 a.m. at this time. She called me and she had told me that she called out my name when I got home, and I responded. And she had a conversation with me. But it wasn't me. I wasn't home. She realized when she went to my room and I wasn't there. I will try to make this as straightforward as possible, considering I'm about to board a plane in half an hour, actually to go and visit my hometown and my parents where this happened. But here it is. When I was around 18 years old, I had been paying my ex-girlfriend at the time a visit, and ended up losing track of time. It was around 1 in the morning at the time in the dead of winter. I would say maybe late January or February. Whilst relaxing with my girlfriend, I had neglected to pay attention to the weather, or even look out the window at the time, considering darkness falls in Lancaster County by around 4:30 on the wintertime. A very intense snow squall rolled in and had developed into a blizzard. After I did realize this, as well as the time, I concluded that for some reason the smartest move would be to leave and make the around 25 to 30 minute drive, even in clear weather, back to my house. Where I live is rather remote. The Amish capital of the world, actually, if you are unfamiliar with Lancaster, but it is miles and miles of rolling hills, crop fields, and woods, with several small towns scattered amongst them. About 10 minutes into my drive, I'm actually having a very difficult time seeing through the endless onslaught of fluffy snow and the fact that I had left my glasses in my girlfriend's bedroom. I was driving at maybe 15 to 20 miles an hour, considering the roads had not yet been plowed and were pretty slick. I got to a familiar portion of my drive about 2 or 3 miles from my old high school. As I'm creeping down the country back roads, I can barely make out some sort of color in my low beams about 20 yards in front of me. Curiously, I angled my front end toward the thing that I was seeing, which was also on my side of the road. As I got close enough to make out what I was seeing, I realized it was a hunched old woman in some kind of blankets and a long skirt. Instantly, I was thinking this is my chance to be a good Samaritan and save a life. It was all of 5 degrees outside that night, and this old woman was very far into the nothingness of the land with no known homes around. I crept up next to her and rolled down my window. At this point, she was no longer being illuminated by my headlights and was alongside my car, maybe around 6 feet outside the passenger side window in the heavy snow. My initial thoughts are this old woman must have dementia or Alzheimer's, some sort of neurological disease. I called out my window to her. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you in need of any help? What are you doing out here? You'll freeze." She didn't respond, and as a matter of fact, just kept slowly creeping forward through the snow. I used my phone flashlight now to get a little bit better view of her. She was wrapped in colorful blankets and had one sort of shrouding her head, so I couldn't see her face. I also took note that it didn't seem like she had on any shoes. Once more I asked, "Ma'am, why don't you let me take you somewhere warm and we can get you some help?" She stopped walking. I was already beginning to shiver just from the cold wind blowing in through my window. The snow was still coming down just as hard as ever. She stood there, facing away from me. "Lady, can you hear me?" I asked, not quite annoyed but confused. Almost as soon as I finished asking this, The old woman swiveled toward my window and stood up straight. This tiny decrepit old woman became a presence like I had never seen. Suddenly, the frail woman stood tall, taller than me, maybe 6'3" or 4 inches. Her face was not hers. It seemed as though whatever it was had on a hyper-realistic old woman's mask, and the largest, most soul-piercing baby blue eyes I have ever seen in my life. So large, in fact, it appeared like they were not even naturally possible for a human to have. But nonetheless, they were beaming at me from behind the holes that were vacant, where the old woman's eyes should have been. The sight took my breath away. Without hesitating, I accelerated my car and slipped a bit in the snow. Long story short, I ended up getting home after calling my ex and telling her to lock her doors. I mentioned it to my parents, and they said it was probably some sick criminal trying to rob some sorry sucker like myself. I told myself that that probably was all it was, but something about the almost animated movements it made, the way it seemingly added feet to its height before my eyes, and its own eyes, I can still picture them so vividly all these years later. They were not natural. Whatever I saw out there surely would have succumbed to the elements, and in a small town like mine, it would have made the news. I'm a believer in paranormal and ghosts and such, but that was a physical being. I just can't explain better than this what I saw, let alone give it a plausible explanation.
Before I start this story, I'd just like to let you all know that I'm predominantly a skeptic, or at least I was until this house. I actually rarely talk about the events that happened in there because I don't have any rational explanation, but that house has stuck with me well into adulthood. Back in 2009, me, my mom, and my stepdad moved into a really old, rustic, rural cottage in England. My father had passed away not too long before, and this was going to be a new start for us all. The house was an absolute bargain. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 very spacious living rooms, and a huge annex at the back that was essentially a second house. We couldn't work out why it was so cheap. We went for the viewing, and the family eventually told us that there was an elderly mother who had passed away there peacefully in the annex, and they just needed to get away from the feeling of her. That probably should have been the first red flag. We weren't put off, and we bought the house. From the off, it was unsettling. My parents didn't see it at first, but I was incredibly uncomfortable there. It was extremely unnerving and cold, and not to mention, it was isolated behind rows of trees and a very long driveway, so far from anyone else. It started on the first night. My room was the one at the end of the corridor, and if you came out of my room, on the right was a bathroom and a locked door that had led to the annex, the place where the elderly mother died. My parents slept a long way down the corridor in the last bedrooms, so I was quite isolated, and directly opposite my room were the stairs. The first night, it was freakishly cold. I pulled my blankets up to my head, but after my dad passed away, I had suffered from insomnia for years, so the cold and the anxieties of moving to a new house all added together with this into zero sleep, so I ended up laying awake for hours, just sort of staring around the room. My bedroom door was one of those old and mismatched wooden country house doors, didn't quite reach the carpets, and after a few hours, I could hear the creaking of floorboards directly outside my room, and shadows that seemed even darker than the darkness of the hallway walking past my door. I presumed one of my parents had gotten up to use the restroom at first, but this went on, back and forth for several minutes, and it was fast, a very brisk walk. And not to mention, next to my door was the locked door to the annex. Anybody walking at that speed would have hit the door, but nothing. freaked me out, and it had me dreading the next night. This kept happening every night for weeks, and I remember vividly one night I actually left my bedroom door open. Around the same time, I heard the creaking. I turned around, and unmistakably, there was a figure, blacker than black, walking forward and backwards in front of the door, just visible in the darkness of the hallway. I couldn't take my eyes off it the entire time it was there. It's safe to say I never slept with the door open again after that night. But this is where things start to get properly creepy. I'd been terrified of this shadow for weeks now. There was a really horrible feeling I had around it, like it was after me. And one night, as I was going downstairs for dinner, I had the same cold feeling, and for just a second, I froze in place in the dark hallway and looked to my right towards the annex door. And there, sure as anything, and without my sleepy eyes to blame it on, I saw the same black shadow walking directly at me at a high speed. I ran downstairs as quickly as I could and told my parents everything. They mostly laughed it off and didn't believe me and tried to reassure me that ghosts aren't real and there was no chance of anything about this old lady still being in the house. Now, a bit of backstory. This old lady was terrified of the previous owner's family dog, so much so that they had to install a pulley system in the house so she could pull a cord from her bedroom that would trigger an old bell to ring in the kitchen if she wanted anything. The whole system was still there when we moved in, and this night, the night after I told my parents, I was awoken around 2 a.m. by this bell in the kitchen ringing loudly and on repeat, like it was being pulled firmly and constantly. I ran out into the corridor, and my parents were there too, equally as confused and concerned as I was. We all looked at each other with ever-increasing worry and ran downstairs into the kitchen to see what was going on. As soon as we entered the kitchen, it stopped. We ventured up into the annex to see what could have caused this, but nothing. No sign of anyone, and my God, I hated it here. It was even colder and more lifeless than the main part of the house, and I just felt like I needed to leave as soon as I could. My parents didn't quite believe that this was a ghost yet, but they were clearly less skeptical than before. From here, any activity became much more obvious. We, my parents included, started to hear knocking from the annex door next to my bedroom, noises from downstairs that sounded like someone was down there, moving. Sometimes my fish tank light would flick on and off with an audible click and wake me up, and I would often wake up to my wardrobe doors being swung open with no breeze in sight. One night, I was sat reading alone in my room, and one of these wardrobe doors opened by itself, wide and with relative force. I got up cautiously, closed it, and ran downstairs to see my parents. When I came up around 15 minutes later, every single cupboard door, around a dozen of them, were open as wide as they would go. Lots more went on too. Taps turning themselves on became a particularly regular occurrence, and one night, I awoke to the sound of my cupboard door opening again and saw droplets of water running from the bathroom next to the annex door all the way to a few feet from my bed. I was terrified. It was around 6 months after all of this started that we eventually moved out. My grandma had begun to grow unwell and couldn't care for herself anymore, and she moved in with us. From the beginning, she hated the house. My grandma was so incredibly sweet and calm, and I've never seen her distressed like she was when she was there. And on one night in particular, when I was sat downstairs in the kitchen with her, she took my hand, pointed directly towards the annex, and said, "Don't you go in there. I don't like it in there." It's safe to say, this scared the crap out of me. On the last night we all spent together in that house, I was awoken by my mum screaming. Clear as day, she said. She felt two hands firmly grab her ankles over the bedsheets and pull her down the bed just a few inches, and right then and there she asked to leave. We went to stay in our old house for a while, but because of size, my stepdad, the biggest skeptic among us, stayed in Lilac Cottage for a few more months. He's still quiet to this day about that house. He hates talking about it, but even he admits that there was something incredibly wrong there. And without much warning, he put the house up for sale, selling it so desperately that he lost almost a quarter of the price he paid for it. He's never told us why. I've promised myself that one day I'll reach out to the current owners of that house and see if they have also experienced anything, but I haven't just yet.
I'm a nurse at a palliative care unit in an old hospital. If you're a nurse at one of these units like me, or know a nurse, please read until the end. I could use your help. Throughout my years working at this hospital, I've seen a lot. Especially being in the palliative care unit, you see a lot of things other people wish they wouldn't. For some of us, at some point, we just have to accept things are as they are. The unit I work in has 9 beds and 9 different bedrooms, all spread along a long corridor. At the start of the corridor is the lift, and coming out of it, you'd find the cleaning room on your right, where we keep all the cleaning equipment and products, and the nurse's room on your left, along with the entrance through the stairs. Because of the building and patient safety, and so we can access the other floors easily if in need, the administration forbade us from locking the stair doors. This isn't ideal because some of our patients and their delusions can go across our room's doors unnoticed and will be a danger to themselves. So we always keep the doors closed by tying a bedsheet around the door handles to keep them together. This is important, so you know why what comes next started out so strange. The nurse's room is where we'll spend most of the night shifts doing all kinds of activities, including resting and actually sleeping. Usually late at night, my routine would include checking on all our patients, checking on all the doors and windows to make sure they're all locked properly, checking on the doors to the stairs, and then spend most of the night checking patient files. This night in particular, I had finished with my rounds and was checking on all the cameras. When my nursing auxiliary came into the nurse's room, she asked me if anything else was needed or if she was okay to sleep for a while. I told her she was fine to go to sleep, so she took off her shoes, laid down with her back to the room and me, facing the wall, and went to sleep. I was reading a new patient's file who was coming into our unit soon, to know what to expect and how to behave around him, when I started hearing footsteps walking up and down the unit's corridor. At first, I ignored them, thinking I was just tired, and that my ears were playing tricks on me. It wouldn't be the first time. As they persisted, though, I started wondering what was going on. I took another look at the cameras, but each and every one of the bedroom and corridor feeds seemed completely normal. The steps, though, kept coming all the way to the nurse's room, stopping about 2 steps away from showing at my door, then turning around and walking back all the way to the opposite end of the corridor. I waited to see if anything changed, but when it didn't, I stood up to go check. That's when one of our patients, the one in room number 7, started calling us frantically. My auxiliary nurse was still asleep, so I walked carefully out of the room, peeked out of the room and looked around. There was nothing there, and the footsteps had stopped, so I rushed to the patient's room. When I got there, he was shouting frantically, huddling against the bed's headboard with what seemed like renewed energy, shouting at me to tell the man in the top hat sitting on the chair in the room to go away and leave him be. Usually with patients like these in this state of stress, we just go along with the delusions to calm them down. In this case, with him screaming in the room, I turned towards the chair and started talking to this imaginary man in a top hat, telling him he needed to go, that the visiting hours were done, and that he needed to leave right now or we'd have to call security. After this, the patient calmed down, thanked me repeatedly for sending the man away, and laid back down to rest. I went back to the nurse's room and back to studying the new patient. As I walked back in, my heart stopped. All I felt was panic gripping my heart inside of me. As I stood there, not knowing what to do and looking at the surveillance cameras, there was a big shadow standing right in the middle of the frame of the camera recording the end of the corridor, right in front of the bedroom I'd just been in. I took one step back and leaned backward to check if I could see anything there, and there was nothing. I gave the cameras another quick glance, and the shadow was still there, standing terrifyingly still in front of this patient's bedroom door. This time, though, when I turned to look directly at the corridor again, this thing was there. For a moment, it felt like everything froze in place, and I just stood there, looking at it like a fool. Then slowly it turned towards me, a pair of strange, dark red eyes showing. It stood like that for a bit, stretched at me and flew into the patient's bedroom, slamming the door behind it. My auxiliary nurse jumped at the slam of the door and started frantically asking me what was going on. I was out of breath by now. I told her what I had just seen and what had just happened, and she couldn't believe me. I asked her to come with me to the patient's bedroom, and she agreed, starting to become curious. We walked slowly through the corridor, passing every door carefully. I was afraid that anything would come flying at us. When we got to the bedroom this thing flew into, I pushed the door open without going in to check for any kind of danger, and immediately felt the breath of freezing air hit me in the face. The air conditioner was on in every room and set to 23 degrees, so this was not normal. Nothing came flying at us like I was afraid would happen, but there, right by the patient's bed, was the shadow. I could tell it was a man, tall and strong with a top hat over his head. I asked my auxiliary nurse if she could see him, not expecting a no. However, that's what I got. She couldn't see anything standing there, and definitely not as clear as I could. Slowly, the shadow turned towards me again. This time it didn't scream. This time it slowly dissipated. Immediately I calmed down. Not only could I not see it anymore, I also couldn't feel it. The sense of calm came over me and the patient seemed okay, so we left the room and went back to the nurse's room. My colleague went back to sleep, but I didn't rest until I checked the rest of the unit to make sure everyone was safe. After that, I couldn't help but stare at the cameras every minute for the rest of the night. Eventually, our shift was over and would become the shift with the most intense experience I ever had. The next day, when nighttime came and I did all my rounds, I went inside room 7 to check on the patient. When I got closer to him, I realized he had passed away. This was my first experience with the shadow man in the top hat, but it wasn't the last and it's still ongoing. I'm the only one who can see him around the unit, which freaks everyone out. Every single time I see him, it's under the same circumstances. I walk into a patient's room and there's his shadow at the feet of their bed. I wait for a little while until he turns to me and dissipates. 1 or 2 days later, the patient passes away. And I know this probably sounds far-fetched, but it's a real story and it's something I have to live with almost every day now. I'm not sure if this thing is killing people or announcing their deaths, but if you're a nurse in a similar unit, or know someone who is, please share this with them and comment when you know about it. I need to know what this is, how to deal with it, and if anyone else has experienced the same thing as me, even if it's a different looking entity.
This happened when I was still a new hire at the company I still work for. At the time, there weren't many job opportunities in the town I lived in, not for the field I wanted work in at least. So when I saw a posting for the job I wanted, with the only drawback being that I relocate, I jumped at the chance. I didn't have much going on for me in my hometown anyways. Most of my friends had moved away after their studies and I didn't have a girlfriend or anything like that. But although I was already considering moving to another town, my plan was to move to a bigger city, not to a comparable small town. I applied anyway, thinking that I should at least try as it was the field I wanted to work in. I ended up getting the job and moved across the country, 2 prefectures over, about 2 hours by car. The move was easy as I didn't have much to move, and the company organized my initial apartment for me with the option to find my own place once the apartment's contract was up. I had just moved in, and after spending the day unpacking and putting things away in my new home, it had gotten really late. I still hadn't had a chance to go food shopping yet, and being a more countryside town, most supermarkets were closed already. There was a drugstore about a 10 to 15 minute drive away, but I didn't really feel like driving, so I decided to walk to the nearby convenience store. It was 24 hours and would definitely have a good selection of food and drinks for my first night's meal. It was only a 10-minute walk, and I felt it would be nice to get a feel for my new neighborhood. The night was cool. It was late fall after all, but it felt crisp and refreshing to be out of the apartment. I walked for a couple of blocks before I saw the convenience store's glow. The neighborhood was dark at night, so the store's glow was a comforting sight. I walked a couple of more minutes, and I was there. I entered the store and was greeted by the store's sole employee for the night. The store was nearly empty, save for a few scattered customers and the lone cashier. I took my time picking up some snacks, a bento, and a couple of beers to celebrate. I gradually became aware that I was now the only customer. There was nothing unusual about that, but for some reason, I started to get a real feeling of unease. The quietness of the store was odd, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerators, and the lighting seemed darker for some reason. I tried to dismiss my feeling I was just being overtired due to my day and got on with what I was doing. I decided to grab some food for breakfast the next day as well and continued my shop. As I turned down the aisle containing bread, a shadowy figure caught my eye. It was a tall, indistinct silhouette, lurking just at the edge of the store towards the back in a darker corner that led to the restrooms. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the dim lighting, or perhaps a shadow cast from outside. But then it moved, darting from the corner, then to a window, with an eerie fluidity that sent a shiver down my spine. I blinked, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shadow persisted, hovering ominously, now just outside the store. It seemed to be watching me, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Since it seemed to be outside, I was in no hurry to get to where it was, so I continued my shop, all the while keeping an eye on the shadow outside. Just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I pretended to shop closer to the window so I could check for it, and it was definitely gone. A shiver once again ran up my spine, and I felt the strong urge to leave and get home as soon as possible. I quickly paid for my items and mumbled a hurried farewell to the cashier, while still darting my gaze all around the store and outside. Stepping back out into the crisp night, I felt an overwhelming urge to get as far away from the convenience store as possible. Then, I noticed the shadowy figure continued to follow me, keeping pace with my every step. Panic gnawed at my insides as I walked briskly through the dimly lit streets, the chilling presence never relenting. After I got a block or so away from the convenience store, however, I could no longer see or feel the shadow's presence. I rushed home after that, continuously checking over my shoulder the whole way. I went to that convenience store plenty of times after that while I lived there, but always made sure to never go back after dark.
I'm a 24-year-old female and work for a semi-busy fire department. We just ran a late-night lift assist and returned to the station at about 1 a.m. During my report, I realized our vitals hadn't uploaded from our Zoll device, blood pressure cuff, and SOP2 monitor. So I walked out to the ambulance, hopped into the back, and started troubleshooting why the vitals weren't sent. I decided to just print them off. As I was getting ready to go back into the station, I, for no reason at all, glanced to the front seat area. There's a small window that glimpses into the front of the ambulance truck, and a rearview mirror for the driver to see what's going on in the back. There was a face in the rearview mirror, a bald man with this horrible scowl on his face. I instantly felt a shot of terror go down me, but tried to talk myself out of it. I was trying to figure out what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it was clearly a man's face. All I could see was his forehead, no visible hair on the sides, which made it seem like he was bald. And then his eyes. He had light wrinkles, but such a hateful look. He was glaring right at me, his eyes staring straight into mine. Needless to say, I got out of the ambulance and pretty much ran back into the station. I didn't recognize the face. We have one bald coworker, but he wasn't on duty that day. The face did actually look a bit like him, and that firefighter is a negative person who doesn't like females in the fire service, but I couldn't be 100% on the face being my coworker. We purchased this house that was built in the 1920s. It's pretty charming on the outside, and it's technically 3 stories. Most of the experiences have happened in the basement where my girlfriend and I stay, but aren't limited to that area. The basement is essentially its own apartment. It has a bedroom with 2 walk-in closets, a laundry room, a kitchen, a bathroom, a wine cellar, a maintenance room, and a living room area. When me and my girlfriend first moved in with her mother, we had the basement to ourselves. Anyways, first night of moving in, we both had night terrors of an old frail lady in white, walking around in front of the bedroom. We were creeped out, but just figured it was nothing. A few nights later, we were getting more stuff unpacked and organized in one of the walk-in closets, and we both heard whispers right next to our ears. My girlfriend ignored it, but right after I said, "Did you just hear that?" and repeated the whisper sound, she got freaked out because she had heard the exact same noise. Fast forward to maybe a month or 2 in, we heard shuffling upstairs, almost like someone walking around with slippers. Her mom wasn't home, so figured someone maybe broke in. Honestly, this house is old and likely an easy target for a break-in, but hadn't triggered the alarms or glass break detectors. I grabbed my Glock 19 and checked upstairs, and when I got to the stairs that lead to the 3rd floor, I could hear the shuffling right next to me. The shuffling was going up the stairs and eventually stopped when it got to the top. After this, the same thing happened again the following day. At this point, we're pretty confident the house is haunted. My girlfriend and I can feel it. We tried researching the previous owners, but really couldn't find much. But maybe I just haven't searched well enough. Fast forward to the next encounter. Me and my girlfriend were doing dry fire training in my living room late at night, on a weekend when my girlfriend's mom was out of town. My girlfriend's mom leaves every other weekend to go hang out with her boyfriend, and he comes over on the weekends that she doesn't visit him. I'm a stickler for firearm safety. I triple check every firearm to ensure it's unloaded, as well as the magazines before I train, and I make sure to leave the ammunition in another room while I'm doing my dry fire. So we're practicing draw stroke, proper presentation, getting to the wall, target transitions, and tactical/emergency reloads. And my girlfriend hears someone whisper, "Be careful," next to her ear while she's timing me. I didn't hear anything, so when she told me what she heard, I grabbed her and went to the room to load my firearm. I got freaked out when she told me because my first thought when she told me was that someone was breaking into my house and is whispering to their buddy to be careful. Keep in mind, it's 1 or 2 in the morning, and me and my girlfriend were on a nocturnal schedule for the weekend, so we can get more time under the night vision goggles. Anyways, she explains it was next to her ear and not coming from outside or anything like that, and I calmed down. Next encounter I had was by myself when I was getting ready to do the dishes. I had my earbuds in, and they have the ambient noise feature where you can still hear with them in. I heard a deep breath in my ear. It made me jump, and I turned around thinking it was my girlfriend trying to mess with me or something. But there was nothing there. I wasn't listening to music when it happened either, so I have no idea what it was. The last encounter we had was when my girlfriend and I were hanging out upstairs with her mom and boyfriend. We were just listening to music and having a couple of drinks, and I grabbed a glass of water and sat it down on a small table to my left. The glass knocked over on its own, and we all watched it happen. Firstly, it tipped over towards the table, not off the table. I got up and tried jumping and stomping near the table to get it to wobble, and nothing happened. I tried to tip the glass over by bumping it, and it wobbled but didn't fall. I tried hitting the table with my knee or elbow, but nothing. When the glass fell on its own, it just knocked over. It didn't wobble first or anything. Everyone saw it happen, and nobody saw me bump it or anything, and I didn't feel myself bump into it either. To my knowledge, that's all that's happened so far. We kept trying to tell my mom's girlfriend about the weird stuff that's happened, but she wrote it all off until the night the glass tipped over on its own. It's possible she's had experiences, but if that's the case, she hadn't told us about any of them. Maybe these experiences are nothing, but maybe they are something. I have no idea.